David Carter squinted through the windshield as his old sedan struggled against the attacking winter storm. He'd left Carpenter City behind hours ago, and did so in such a hurry that he hadn't checked the weather. 3 days earlier, he sat outside of a downtown bar for drinks with a friend, wearing short sleeves and a warm breeze. Now he found himself drowning in the relentless onslaught of sleet and snow. Midwestern weather at its finest. Giant flakes danced in the headlight beams, forming a sort of glittering curtain that obscured anything much further than the front bumper. Despite the canned jazz sounds coming from the stereo, David only heard the wind, which thrashed and crashed against the vehicle like angry waves, making the whole car shudder. He clenched the steering wheel tightly as the vehicle lifted from the pavement, haphazardly sliding for several yards before it found its grip again. When David approached the interstate that afternoon, it was a parking lot. Now he passed through the gray Midwestern countryside on roads less traveled. As it grew later and later into the evening, David was forced to abandon his original plan to sleep in the car somewhere in St. Louis. His only goal now was to make it to some cheap motel or even a 24-hour diner. The car lurched to the side as it lifted again from the road, this time failing to regain its grip on the slushy path. David hugged the steering wheel as he spun around and around again before smashing up and over the banks of the road, slowing to a stop in a tall snowdrift with a long, dry belch. He looked back in the direction of the road, pushing the car into reverse and accelerating, but instead of moving, the engine crackled and popped, and a burst of smoke erupted from the hood. He didn't have to get out of the car to know that the damage was done. He was now stranded. David peered at the fuel gauge, almost empty. He tried not to panic. He had to think rationally. Staying in the car could be a one-way ticket to hypothermia. The fumes didn't get him first. David tried his best to bat away the anxiety pulling at his collar. He pressed the accelerator again, but the wheels spun uselessly in the snow. Overcome with frustration, he pounded on the car horn, screaming a string of obscenities to match its piercing cry into the freezing cold evening. He turned the heater to the max, knowing that it would only last as long as the fuel did, and rubbed his hands together. The traveler had no choice. He needed to find shelter. David turned the car off, and with a deep breath, pulled his coat tight and opened the door. The chilly winds immediately stole away any warm air left in his lungs and pricked his exposed skin like 1,000 needles. With no other option at hand, David stepped into the storm. He hadn't been in the area long, but he knew that there was at least another mile or so before he'd find many houses or any help. But he trudged through the snow with almost no visibility until he saw a faint outline of a street sign. Church Street. Where this one street subdivision began, all other signs of life vanished. Church Street had not been salted, plowed, or driven on for hours. If the street sign hadn't been there, a passerby wouldn't see any hint of humanity at all. Still, the faint glimmer of hope filled David's chest with warmth. As thick chunks of fresh powder clung to his boots, he began the arduous climb up the steep street on the hill, thinking that the massive evergreens around him looked like a forest of Christmas trees. He crested the hill, and the first few houses came into view. Some had lights on here and there, but most appeared to be quiet, possibly empty. Suppressing the shivers eager to overwhelm him, David considered knocking on one of the doors to ask for help. But could that possibly work? Never thought to find himself in a position like this. Do people answer the door when they're not expecting anyone? Even the most welcoming and optimistic people would keep their doors shut to strangers at a night like this. If he could find an empty house with an unlocked door or window, he'd be set for the night. He'd be best off lying low. David wouldn't touch anything unnecessary. He didn't mean any harm. He didn't even care about finding something to eat or getting a good night's sleep. He just wanted to feel warm again. Skipping the first house, David approached the backyard of the second, where the snow-covered stairs were untouched. A faint light deep inside was likely left on to deter burglars, so he shrugged it off, and he pulled on the sliding door. Locked. The air around his head fogged as he exhaled with frustration. Without time to spare, David trudged to the next property, and then the next, feeling an ice pick to the heart with each heavy step. As he closed in on the next property, he noticed a dim light inside, just like there had been in the first house, and he caught the slight smell of skunk somewhere in the winter winds, and he thought a joint or two sounded pretty great at this moment. Feeling hopeless, David reached out for the door handle before him and pulled gently. With a light clicking sound, the door gave way. Zapped with a surge of adrenaline, David couldn't help but smile. But as he started to open the door further, shifting his body to slide inside, he heard movement from within the house. He stepped backward as quickly as he could, quietly shutting the door and diving into the bushes at the side of the house. That was close. David stayed there, hidden in the shadows for as long as he could stand it. He breathed into his hands, hoping it could camouflage his cloudy breath and warm his frostbitten fingers. His heart sank as he saw the shape of a young woman appear on the other side of the glass door. She was pretty, with red curls, probably late teens or early 20s. Maybe she'd understand, David thought. Maybe she'd offer to help. But the caress of wet sleet across his face pulled him back to reality. She'd have to be an imbecile to let him inside. So David moved on to another locked house, and then another, and another. All of these empty buildings. All this empty space. People with money to hide from the winter in their Florida mansions or their plantation homes. How could they sleep at night knowing that their second or third houses were empty while people on the street freeze to death? Driven by increasing desperation, David shuffled like a zombie toward the very last house at the end of the street. He tried the back door, and to his immense relief, it opened. He held there for a moment, bracing for sounds of someone inside. But the house was quiet, and dark, and warm. The man slipped into the vintage building, shrugging off his coat and wrapping it around his snowy shoes. He didn't want to leave any trace of his visit. He just wanted to survive the night. For a moment, the drastic change in temperature was too much for his lungs to compute, and he had to brace himself against the wall as he grew dizzy from lack of air. David looked around as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. Framed pictures and mass-produced art pieces cluttered the walls, along with multiple large wooden crosses. The photos depicted a sprawling collection of family and friends, couples smiling happily at weddings and birthdays, and children of all ages with fingers stained with egg dye at Easter, and sitting on the laps of department store Santas. This display, along with the furniture choices and lingering smell of must and black tea, made it clear that David had entered the house of an elderly couple. He moved carefully, trying not to make a sound as he slipped into the kitchen. With a steady hand, he grabbed an apple from a bowl of fruit, hoping a small snack will help him make it till morning. Suddenly, the telephone rang. From the sound of it, There was a phone rattling loudly from every room in the house. David could see one in the hallway he'd just left and another hanging on the kitchen wall. The ringing echoed from somewhere upstairs, too, and David froze, listening to the phone ring and ring and ring, waiting for the caller to throw in the towel or the sounds of an answering machine taking over. At last, the ringing stopped with a click. But the caller hadn't hung up, and no answering machine greeted them. To his absolute horror, the ceiling began to creak and shift as someone in the room above him moved across the room to answer the phone. David wanted to collapse, to simply give up. But he knew that, if seen, he'd be cast back outside into the storm to freeze to death. Then again, maybe the homeowners would call the cops. Even a sterile jail cell sounded better than the snow. Although, they may not be the type to call the cops. Maybe they'd handle things themselves with a little help from the Second Amendment. David's eyes landed on the dark outline of an urn on a shelf near the television. It had a nameplate, but he couldn't read it from where he stood. There was some relief in the thought that only one person may be home instead of two. The homeowner's muffled voice came through the ceiling. It belonged to a woman. She arrived at the top of the staircase, and for a second, David felt a flash of regret. If anyone would have opened the door, blindly trusting a stranger in need, it would have been this old lady. But it was too late. He'd already made his choice. Just as the light above the stairs came to life, David dove behind a large rocking chair tucked into the corner of the room. His heartbeat rattled in his eardrums so violently that he wondered if she could hear it too. David watched in the glass of the back of the door as the tiny old woman from the pictures descended to the main floor. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate as she crossed behind the couch and met her reflection. She quietly looked through the glass into the blizzard outside, but he couldn't tell what she was searching for. David wondered how much of a mess he'd made in the snow walking up to the door, and how much she could see. Then the woman sighed and stepped away, and David let himself relax a little. He desperately hoped that she'd go back upstairs and put herself to sleep so he could figure out his next move. But the woman crossed to the hallway instead and lifted the phone from the cradle on the wall like a sleeping infant. With its long cord following her across the floor, she returned to the back door and reached with her bony fingers for the light switch on the wall. The bright fluorescent fixtures above the porch illuminated.
"Yes,"
she said into the phone.
"I'm looking at my back porch now. There are footprints leading up to the door, but none leading away."
The entire universe swirled around David as he realized he was already caught. The old woman quickly glanced around the room before hurrying up the stairs much faster than she'd come down. He held out hope that she'd turn the light off above the stairs and return the room to darkness, but the bulb kept glowing as the floorboards above him creaked again. If she called the police, he thought, he could simply explain. Then again, cops weren't always known for hearing people out. Now might be the only chance to make it back outside, but where would he go? He stepped towards the back door, but froze. Then he stepped towards the kitchen and froze again. It was too much to handle. He couldn't think. He couldn't move. Panic surged, and his breathing shifted into manual. As he grappled with what to do, David saw a flash of yellow light outside the front window. He carefully stood, sticking to the shadows as he approached the curtains. In the small opening between the fabric and the wall, he saw a handful of men approaching with flashlights. They had armed themselves with baseball bats. One carried a shotgun. David had to hide, and fast. There was a closed door at the side of the stairs. likely either a closet or basement stairs. Taking his chances, he slightly opened the door, overjoyed to find a set of aging wooden slats fading into a dark cellar below. Just as the door latched quietly behind him, David heard the front door of the house open and the shouting voices of the men. They were angry, threatening, enjoying themselves. The furniture above squeaked and thudded as they tore the old woman's home apart. It was only a matter of time before they'd come to check the basement. David slid his hands along the cold walls, finding his way through the musty darkness. As his eyes adjusted, he discovered a large pile of crates, storage bins, and suitcases. In a frenzy, he threw his coats and shoes into one of the smaller suitcases and then eyed the largest one. He climbed inside, curling himself into a tight ball and pulled the zipper closed just as he heard the basement door open. David lay there, trying to control his breathing as his entire body trembled with fear. A pair of heavy boots clunked their way down the wooden steps. David could hear the men rummaging around, moving small boxes and furniture, and one of them began to whistle.
Come out, wherever you are,"
one teased in a sing-song voice. David squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear.
"Nobody's down there, man. She probably just scared herself."
The pair chuckled and threw a few other theories back and forth as they climbed back up the stairs. David felt so grateful for the silence. But he knew better than to let himself relax. He waited there, horribly claustrophobic, as the search party canvassed the second floor of the house before they returned to the main level. Then, after a few moments more of muffled conversations, the door slammed shut, and the house became still again, like they had never been there at all. The crunchy footsteps faded, and David finally unzipped the suitcase, tumbling forward and splattering across the ice-cold cement as he gasped for air. His aching lungs filled with splinters as they fully expanded again, and he just stayed there, staring at the crooked floorboards above. He pictured a countdown installed just above his heart, ticking downward with every oscillation faster and faster towards its very last beat. After a while, David carefully made himself a bed with a pile of old quilts and tried to get some rest. Exhaustion overtook him, and he drifted into a fitful sleep. The early morning sun gently stirred him back to life, and he quietly folded the quilts while considering his next move. As multiple voices approached outside the front of the house, along with the sound of several parking cars, David begrudgingly forced himself back into the suitcase. He heard the front door open and the floorboards creak as a number of people entered the home. At first, he assumed it was the same group from last night, but the chatter of radios told him the police had arrived. They made a quick pass through the basement, but it was cursory at best. After they left, David remained in the suitcase, too terrified to move. Hours passed. The suitcase was stifling, but the fear of being caught kept him in place until he couldn't stand it any longer. He dozed off a few times. Whether asleep or unconscious, he couldn't tell. But he heard the sound of the front door open and close and open and close again and open and close, and after a while, it closed without opening again, and the floorboards no longer winced under anyone's weight. Stealing a glance through the barely opened zipper, David saw the afternoon sun taking its last breath, and he began his uncomfortable exit from his hiding place. A noise escaped his lips, and he tensed, listening for any reaction. Nothing. He waited a few more minutes, then cautiously emerged. He needed a plan. He looked around the basement for anything that could help him survive outside. He found an old coat, slightly too big, and some worn boots that were better than his soaked shoes. Gathering his courage, David climbed the basement stairs, listening for any sign of movement in the house. Positive he was alone, David slowly opened the basement door. Directly in front of him stood the old woman. She screamed. A horrible, petrified scream one could never forget, and hurled the coffee mug she held in his direction. It smashed against the wall, exploding a shatter of porcelain and cocoa as David tried to calm her and explain. And then she fell silent and froze, staring at him with wide, terror-struck eyes. And as a final croak escaped from her chapped lips, she collapsed to the floor. There was no doubt about it. The poor old woman had died of fright. David sprinted through the front door, snow crunching beneath his boots as he bolted down Church Street. The blizzard had lessened and the streets were mostly plowed, but the cold still bit at his exposed skin. He saw neighbors emerging from the houses. He heard some of them shouting into the frigid air, but he didn't comprehend what they were saying. His fear drove him forward, his lungs once again unable to obtain anything more than shallow gasps. Suddenly, David lost his grip in the snow and painfully tumbled to the ground, desperately crawling like a rabid animal before finding his footing again. He could hear the sirens and the men chasing him, men armed with baseball bats and guns. There was nowhere for him to go, but he just kept running, his vision blurring, fire ripping through his muscles. Finally, he reached the very end of Church Street. In an explosion of pain, a white pickup truck smashed directly into David from a nearby driveway, tossing him limply through the air. The snowy asphalt rushed to greet him and swallowed him whole. David woke in a small room lit by a single overhead bulb. His temples rattled with the beat of his pulse, and the flames of excruciating pain licked every inch of his body. The room was the size of a closet, with a few random boxes and small mattress that supported him. Otherwise, the place was empty. Whispering voices drifted in from the partially open doorway. David unsteadily rose and crept towards the door. He spied through the crack, trying to make sense of the low, murmuring voices. He pushed the door open, wincing as the hinges creaked loudly, but no one seemed to notice. The hallway beyond was dark and narrow, lined with a dozen or so closed doors. David moved cautiously, his cold, bare feet silent on the worn linoleum floor. The voices grew louder as he approached an opening in the larger space. David stopped at the threshold and peered inside. A group of cloaked figures stood around an altar draped in black cloth, bowing their heads and chanting together. The flickering torches revealed ancient pages covered in strange symbols and surfaces covered by glass bottles and seemingly ancient tools. As David took another step, his toe collided with a small table holding a metal tray, sending it clattering across the floor. The figures fell silent and turned, all of them looking at him at once. He took off running back to the hallway as thundering footsteps echoed behind him. He turned a corner and gasped as the hall seemed to carry on for eternity. The tall stone walls dripped with moisture as they disappeared into a void ahead. It wasn't just a hallway. It was a tunnel. And David was trapped. Angry hands clawed at him from behind, yanking his limbs backwards and dragging him across the floor. David kicked and struggled, but he was severely outnumbered.
Let me go!
He screamed, his voice hoarse. Rough rope quickly wrapped his wrists, and a pair of figures forced David deeper into the tunnels, practically carrying his weight. As they marched on either side of him, David stumbled repetitively, the ropes cutting into his wrists. His mind was racing. This didn't make any sense. What did they want with him? Finally, the tunnel gave birth to a massive chamber. Ice-cold air came in from above, and looking up, David could see bright moonlight sneaking in through the opening of an old stone well. As the figures planted David in the center of the room, the others gathered in a large circle around them. At the entrance, a tall woman stood apart from the others. She removed her hood, approaching David with a chilling smile.
"Hello there,"
she said.
"I'd like to apologize for the ropes and the truck and all that. We're only doing what we must."
Where am I?
David croaked, his throat dry. The woman smiled.
"You're right where you belong."
David couldn't believe what was happening.
I'm sorry.
He cried.
I would have died out there in the storm last night. I only needed a place to stay warm.
A small, silent man approached with an ancient-looking book and placed it on the altar in front of the woman. She ignored David's pleas as she flipped through its pages, which were stained and worn with age.
Please, call the police. I don't care. I didn't mean any harm.
Now the woman laughed.
"Whatever you're going on about, it doesn't matter."
Of course it matters.
He cried.
I wasn't even supposed to be here. I got stuck because of the storm.
"And for that we are grateful,"
the woman said.
"You were chosen, and the storm is how she led you to us."
The others around the room began to chant again, so quietly that David almost couldn't hear them. The woman's gaze remained fixed directly on him as she continued.
"I'm one of the high matrons. My name is Mrs. Keating. We'll try to make things as comfortable as possible for you, though we can only do so much."
You have to let me go.
"I'm sure you're very confused and scared,"
she said.
"In fact, I see you've soiled yourself. Poor thing. But don't you go on getting embarrassed about that. It's a very typical reaction for someone in your position. We know you're overwhelmed by many very strong feelings right now, and those feelings are valid."
David pulled at his restraints, chafing his skin.
"Because of you, Mother will grow stronger. Because of you, we move forward."
Mother?
David repeated.
What?
"She was a voice in the dark, and the darkness took her for it. But fire cannot silence her. Ash cannot bury her. She lives inside the words, written in fear, in truth, in blood."
Every figure in the room suddenly spoke in one voice.
"Giver of all things, provider of protections, teller of all tales." Such great powers require support, sustenance, and sacrifice. We are her voice, we are her sight, and you will be her beating heart.
David thrashed around.
You're insane.
He spat.
How could you believe this shit?
Mrs. Keating placed the warm palm of her hand against David's cheek.
"Mother doesn't need you to believe, dear. She only needs your blood."
Before the scream could leave his lips, unseen hands stuffed a ragged piece of fabric between his teeth, which pulled back painfully and tied into a gag. The same rough rope that bound his wrists wrapped around his ankles, and the figures on each side of him placed him on a jagged plank of wood directly below the well opening. Mrs. Keating appeared behind him with a long, rusting blade and used it to carve an incision across his forehead. A waterfall of dark blood gushed over David's face. He was practically blind, but he watched as the blurry shape of the woman handed the knife to the same silent man that had brought her the book. The cloaked figures around the room bustled with excitement. The plank that held David was fastened on each side to a long, rusty chain that disappeared into the sky, and as the figures began chanting again, he was slowly raised through the air inch by inch toward the opening above him. The ice-cold air reached out to greet him. The plank shook and tilted as the figures fell away, and the chanting grew quieter. Up, up, up. The chain continued, finally clicking into place as David's body passed through the well, coming to a stop atop the old stones. His eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness. He was in some sort of structure, sagging and tilted, like a makeshift shack. He could make out the shapes of leaves rustling in the wind, and now he heard the sounds of the forest around him. David pulled at the restraints, but they wouldn't budge. All he could do was wait. But for what? He had no idea. Then, in the pitch black, he heard it. It was a terrible sound that started low before growing in pitch and volume. A horrible hybrid of laughter and howling that echoed off the walls like wicked wind chimes. The sound grew louder and louder, reverberating through the darkness and overwhelming his eardrums as a terrible dark shadow crossed in from the darkness. As David screamed and pulled at the ropes with all his might, he heard the figures below him once again. But they were no longer chanting. They were laughing. And as the monster closed in, everything went black.